The call came on a Sunday night in November, and I knew from my son started the conversation that he hadn't just picked up the phone to check in. He asked about the weather first, then about whether I'd seen the hockey scores, and then, just before I thought we were winding down, he said it. "Dad, have you changed the beneficiary on your RRSP yet?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I was planning to change anything, but because I hadn't expected the question. I was sitting on a plastic chair outside a small restaurant in Dumaguete, watching motorbikes go by, and the word RRSP landed like something from a completely different world, which I suppose it was. I was 63 years old. I had been living in the Philippines for 7 months, and 4 months before that call, I had started seeing someone. I thought my kids would be glad, maybe a little surprised, maybe a little cautious. I was not expecting my son to bring up my retirement account on a Sunday night. If I'm being honest, I didn't handle it well. I said something like, "Craig, I'm not dead yet, and even if I were, that's my business." He went quiet. I made it worse by adding, "Can I just live my life without everybody going through my paperwork?" He said he wasn't going through my paperwork. He was just asking. We ended the call early, and I sat outside that restaurant for another half hour, too irritated to go back inside. The strange part is that 6 months before that conversation, none of it was even on my mind. I hadn't come to the Philippines looking for a relationship. I want to be clear about that, because I know how it sounds. Older Canadian man, recently retired, moves to Southeast Asia. People are going to assume things, and I understand why. But that wasn't what happened. My wife passed away 4 years ago. Liver cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. We had been married 31 years, and I won't try to put that into a sentence. After she died, I stayed in our house in Kelowna for 2 more years. I watched a lot of baseball. I went to the same grocery store every week and bought more food than I needed because I'd never learned how to shop for one. I had a good life on paper. I had my CPP and a bit of savings. I had 2 kids who called regularly and a few friends who invited me to things. But I was lonely in a way I hadn't expected. Not the kind of lonely where you're bored. The kind where you can be in a room full of people and still feel like you've somehow come untethered from everything. I don't say this looking for sympathy. I say it because it's why I eventually started thinking about leaving. A colleague from my old office had moved to Portugal after retiring. A cousin had done something similar in Costa Rica. I spent about a year reading, looking at maps, thinking. Eventually, I landed on the Philippines. The cost of living was manageable. English was widely spoken. And something about being near the water appealed to me in a way I couldn't fully explain. I told everyone it was temporary. I sold the Kelowna house, put things in storage, told Craig and my daughter Isabel I'd try it for a year and see. Neither of them was thrilled. But they knew me well enough to know that once I'd thought something through for a year, I was going to do it anyway. The first few months in Dumaguete were mostly about finding my footing, figuring out which market had the best produce, learning that rain here doesn't mean what it means in BC, getting used to the heat in a way I never quite managed. It wasn't exciting, it was just different, and that was what I had needed. Then I met Cynthia. I'm not going to change her name. She knows I talk about my life, and she said she didn't mind. Cynthia was 48. I know what the age gap looks like from the outside, 15 years. And I'm not going to pretend that doesn't raise questions, because I had some of those questions myself. But she wasn't some young woman just starting out. She was a widow. Her husband had died 6 years earlier from a heart attack. She had 2 adult children of her own. She ran a small tailoring shop near the city center, had her own apartment, her own routines, her own complicated life. We met at a community language exchange group that a friend had suggested I try just to have something to do on Tuesday evenings. Cynthia was there helping some of the local students practice their conversational English. I sat across from her at a table, trying not to sound like I was just talking about the weather. She was warm and funny and did not seem at all impressed by me. which I found oddly refreshing. About 2 weeks later, I saw her again at the market. She remembered my name, which surprised me. I asked if she wanted to get merienda somewhere. She laughed and said she had already eaten. I said that wasn't really the point. She smiled. That was the beginning of it. We started spending time together once a week, then twice. I didn't tell my kids right away. Not because I was hiding it, I just didn't know what it was yet. But by the time 3 months had passed, I knew it wasn't nothing. And so I did what I probably should have done more carefully than I did. I called Craig and Isabel on a Sunday afternoon. We did the usual check-in, how's work, how are the kids, how's the weather in Hamilton. And then I said I had something to mention. There was a pause. Isabel said, "Is everything okay?" I said yes, then told them there was someone I'd been spending time with. Craig asked how old she was. Isabel asked how we met. Then Craig asked if she worked. I said yes. He asked if she'd ever been married. I told him she was widowed. He asked if she had asked me for money. I said no. He said, "Not yet." And that word just sat there. Isabel said they weren't trying to upset me. I said I knew that. But the questions kept coming. Does she know about your finances? Have you changed any documents? What do you really know about her family? I got defensive in a way I'm not proud of. I told them I wasn't 19 years old, and I didn't need a background check run on someone I had coffee with. Isabel said they were worried. I said they didn't need to be. Then she asked if I'd thought about coming back to Kelowna, at least for the winter. That was when I realized the conversation had taken a turn I hadn't planned for. After that call, I stopped bringing Cynthia up. I was tired of feeling like every time her name came into a conversation, I had to defend something. Meanwhile, we kept seeing each other. It wasn't dramatic. She came by my apartment sometimes. I'd go by her shop. We'd walk along the boulevard in the evenings. She had become a normal part of my week. And I wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. Then one evening, while we were eating at a place she liked near the waterfront, she put down her fork and asked me something quietly. She said, "Do your children know about me?" I said yes. She looked at me for a moment. "Do they like me?" I told her they had never met her. She didn't say anything right away. Then she said, "That's not really what I asked." She was right. I knew she was right, so I told her the truth. I told her my kids were worried. I told her Craig had asked about money on that first call. I expected her to be hurt, or to get defensive on my behalf. Instead, she just nodded slowly and said, "If my daughter was seeing a foreign man I had never met, I would ask the same questions." That surprised me. I asked if any of this bothered her. She said, "A little, but they are your children. They love you. That is not nothing." Then she said something I was not prepared for. She said, "You should never give me money to prove something to your family. Not to make them stop worrying, not to feel generous, not for any reason like that." I told her that wasn't what I was thinking. She said, "Good. I am not telling you because I want it. I am telling you because I don't." That should have settled things. For a while, it did. But a few weeks later, Isabel called by herself. It was a Thursday morning her time, and she sounded like she had thought carefully about what she was going to say. She didn't ask about Cynthia's job or her age or how often we saw each other. She asked me one question. She said, "Dad, is she named on anything?" I asked what she meant. "I mean your RRSP, your life insurance policy, any of it." I told her no. She said, "I'm not asking because of that. I'm asking because I need to know if you're thinking about it." I could hear her trying to stay level. I remember thinking that should have made me more patient. It didn't. I said, "Isabel, that is my money. I worked for it. Your mother and I worked for it." She said, "I know." Just those 2 words. And for some reason that stopped me cold. Because she wasn't demanding anything. She wasn't saying she was entitled to it. She was saying she was afraid I might make a big decision from a place of emotion rather than clear thinking. And she knew me well enough to know I was capable of that. I had moved across the world in 3 months flat. I had sold the family home without agonizing over it for long. When I decided to do something, I did it. She asked one more question before we hung up. She said, if it came to it, if you were to get married someday, would any of it go to her? I stared out the window for a moment. I said, Isabel, I honestly don't know. She said, okay, no argument, no tears, just okay, and somehow that was the hardest thing she could have said. I thought about it for days, because she was raising something I had genuinely not thought through. Not just the money. The whole question of what it means to get serious about someone at 63. When I was younger, the questions were simpler. Do you get along? Do you want the same things? Can you make a life together? Those questions still mattered. But there was another one in the room now, and it wasn't comfortable to look at directly. What happens to all of it when one of us is gone? I hadn't planned for any of that. My will was outdated. It still listed my wife as the primary beneficiary on my RRSP because I hadn't dealt with that properly after she passed. My life insurance paperwork was in a folder in a storage unit in Kelowna that I hadn't opened since I left. My power of attorney named my sister-in-law, who was 72 years old and lived in Prince George and had her own health situation to manage. None of that was a plan. It was just things I hadn't gotten around to fixing. I told Cynthia about the call when she came over that weekend. We were having lunch and I just brought it up the same way Isabel had directly. I said, my daughter asked if you're named on my RRSP or my insurance. Cynthia put her glass down. And what did you tell her? I told her no. She looked at me. Why would you name me? We've been together less than a year. I said I wasn't saying I would. I was just trying to think out loud about the future. She said, your children are the ones who should be thinking about your future, not me, not yet. She paused, and maybe not ever. That depends on what this becomes. I almost laughed. I said, that's it? That's all you have to say? She said, what else do you want me to say? I'm not waiting for you to die, if that's what you're really asking. I have my shop. I have my children. I have my own life. I am with you because I like being with you, not because I am waiting to inherit something. I didn't know what to say to that. I felt embarrassed, not because I thought she was lying, but because I had let other people's fears get so far into my head that I had started looking at her through a lens that wasn't fair to either of us. After that, I made a decision. I wanted Isabel to meet her, not over a video call, in person. Because I had a feeling that whatever was happening between me and Cynthia, and whatever my daughter thought of it, wasn't going to get resolved any other way. Isabel had already said she had no interest in flying to the Philippines. She'd said it twice, so I didn't push it. But 2 months after that Thursday call, she sent me a message that just said, Dad, what time of year is best to visit? I read it 3 times. I called her instead of texting back. I said, are you serious? She said, I think I need to see it for myself. I understood what she meant. She wanted to see how I was living. She wanted to meet Cynthia, and she probably wanted to make sure her father hadn't completely lost the plot. We found a week that worked around her schedule, and I spent the next month trying not to build it up into something it didn't need to be. I picked her up at the airport in Cebu. When she walked out through the arrival doors, I realized it had been 11 months since I'd hugged one of my kids. That surprised me, how much it got to me. She looked tired from the flights, the layover, the whole long trip from Hamilton. She looked at me and said, you look tanner. I said, you look tired. She said, I am, and then she laughed, which helped. On the drive back to Dumaguete, she asked about hospitals, about whether I had decent internet, about power outages, about what I did when I got sick. I answered everything. Some of the questions made perfect sense. A few of them made me feel like I was being evaluated, but I had promised myself going in that I was not going to spend her entire visit getting my back up. The first full day, I let her rest and get adjusted to the heat. The second morning, Cynthia came by. I had warned them both. Cynthia knew Isabel had concerns. Isabel knew Cynthia knew. We all walked into that morning with the weight of everything that had been said and not said over the past several months. It was stiff at first, very stiff. There was too much smiling, too much politeness that felt like armor. I made coffee and hovered uselessly in the kitchen for longer than necessary. Cynthia asked Isabel how the flight was. Isabel asked Cynthia how long she'd had her shop. And then, very slowly, they started talking without me having to prompt anything. I watched it happen and tried not to look like I was watching. We went out for lunch. I half expected Isabel to be cataloging everything, watching for signs I was being managed or taken advantage of. Maybe she was. But nothing happened that would have given her anything to work with. Cynthia didn't make a show of things. She didn't defer to me constantly or perform any kind of role. She was just herself, which was what I had been trying to tell my kids for months. At one point, I got up to use the washroom. When I came back, the two of them were deep in conversation, and they didn't stop when I sat down. Later, after Cynthia had headed back to her shop, I asked Isabel what they had been talking about. She said, "I asked her what she liked about you." I said, "That's a dangerous question." Isabel looked at me. She said, "You're patient, and that you actually listen, and that being around you makes her feel like she doesn't have to pretend to be something she's not." I sat with that for a moment. Isabel said, "She didn't say anything about money. She didn't mention Canada. She didn't talk about what you could do for her." I said, "No, she wouldn't." Isabel didn't say much after that, but something had shifted. Over the rest of the week, I showed her my actual life. Not the postcard version, the real day-to-day. The market where I bought groceries. The spot where I had coffee every morning. The route I walked along the waterfront. The church near the corner where the bells woke me up on Sundays. She met a few people I had come to trust. She saw that I had a life here, that I wasn't adrift and waiting to be rescued. But she also noticed things I had genuinely stopped seeing. One evening she asked what would happen if I had a medical emergency and Cynthia wasn't reachable. I said I'd call for help. She said, "Who specifically?" I didn't have a name ready. She asked where my provincial health coverage stood. I told her I had travel insurance. She asked if I had read the exclusion section carefully, specifically the part about pre-existing conditions and extended stays. I had not read it carefully. She asked when I had last looked at my power of attorney. I told her my sister-in-law in Prince George was listed. Isabel looked at me and said, very quietly, "Dad, Aunt Patricia is 72, and her hip has been bad for 2 years." I didn't have an answer for that. She asked where I kept copies of important documents. I said I had some things in a folder in my apartment. She asked if Craig knew where the folder was. She asked if anyone here knew to call him if something happened. She asked if my RRSP beneficiary had ever been updated since my wife passed. The answer to almost all of it was some version of no. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say she was making too much out of it. But she wasn't, and I knew she wasn't. I had spent so much energy the past few months defending Cynthia, defending my choices, defending my right to live the way I wanted to live, that I had missed a whole other category of things I needed to deal with. Things that had nothing to do with Cynthia. Things I should have sorted out the moment I got on that plane. 2 nights before Isabel's flight home, she asked if we could sit outside together, just the two of us. I could tell from the way she said it that this was going to be more than small talk. She said, "I need to tell you something." My stomach dropped. I thought maybe Cynthia had said something to her, or she had found something that confirmed a worry she'd been carrying all along. I said, "What happened?" She said nothing happened. She looked at me. "I like her, Dad." I stared at her. She said, "I came here thinking I was going to find something that would make sense of why we've all been worried. I thought maybe she was pushing you toward things. I thought maybe you were paying for her whole life and just not telling us. I thought maybe you were lonely in a way that was making you see what you wanted to see." That was hard to hear out loud, even though I knew she'd been thinking it. She said, "I don't see any of that." I said, "No, you wouldn't." She told me Cynthia seemed genuine. She said she could see that we were easy with each other, that nothing looked performed or forced. She said she didn't feel like Cynthia was trying to insert herself into something she had no place in. But then she said, "I'm still worried about you." I said, "I know." She said, "Not because of her, because of you." That got my attention. She told me I had no emergency plan. My provincial coverage had almost certainly lapsed. My power of attorney named someone who was barely managing her own affairs. My RRSP still had outdated beneficiary information that could create a mess at probate. My kids didn't know the name of a single person here they could call if something went wrong. I had handled the big thing, moving my life across the world, and left a pile of small things undone that suddenly weren't small at all. And then she said something I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "You were so defensive about Cynthia that you started treating every question like it was an attack. But some of what we were asking wasn't really about her at all. It was just about you, about the fact that you're getting older and you're far away, and none of us really knows what your life looks like on an ordinary Tuesday." I didn't argue. I couldn't. I asked her what she thought I should do. She said, "Talk to someone who actually knows what they're doing, an estate lawyer, a financial advisor who works with Canadian expats. Not me, not Craig, not somebody you met at a coffee shop. Someone who can help you get your house in order without it turning into a family argument." That was one of the most useful things anyone had said to me in a long time. The next day, I told Cynthia about the conversation. We were sitting in her shop, and she was working on something while I talked. When I finished, she put her work down. She said, "Your daughter is very smart." I said, "Don't tell her that. I'll never hear the end of it." Cynthia smiled. Then I asked her something I had been putting off. If things kept going the way they were going, if this eventually became something more permanent, what did she expect from me, financially? She got still for a moment. Then she said, "I expect you to be honest with me, and I expect us to talk before either of us makes a big decision." She paused. "I am not asking for anything more than that." I kept thinking about it afterward. It was a simple answer, but it meant something to me, because honesty and actual conversation were exactly what I hadn't been having with my kids. I had been reacting, defending, deflecting. I hadn't been talking. Before Isabel left, the three of us had dinner together one last time. It felt nothing like that first stilted lunch. Nobody was performing. Nobody was being assessed. At one point, Isabel said something to Cynthia about the heat, and Cynthia said something back that made my daughter actually laugh. A real laugh, not a polite one. I sat there watching them and thought, quietly, maybe this is going to be okay. The next morning I drove her to the ferry terminal for the first leg back to Cebu. Before she went inside, she hugged me and held on for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not asking you to come home." I said, "I know." She said, "Just get your stuff sorted, please." I told her I would, and I meant it. About 2 weeks after she flew back, I sat down with an expat legal consultant in Dumaguete who had been recommended by someone I trusted here. I also got on a video call with a financial advisor back in BC who had experience with Canadians living abroad. The legal meeting was less dramatic than I'd built it up to be. The financial call was the eye-opener. I found out that my RRSP beneficiary had never been properly updated after my wife passed. The designation still referenced her estate in a way that could create a probate complication down the road. My life insurance had a beneficiary provision I hadn't touched in 8 years. My power of attorney was legally valid, but practically useless given that Aunt Patricia had her own health situation to deal with. My travel insurance policy had an extended stay clause buried in the exclusions that I had never read. None of it was catastrophic yet, but left alone, any of it could become someone else's problem on the worst day of their lives. I updated the RRSP beneficiary to split between Craig and Isabel. I had a new power of attorney drawn up with Craig as the primary and Isabel as the alternate. I reviewed my travel insurance policy, line by line, asked about the extended stay exclusion specifically, and ended up switching to a policy that was actually suited to someone who wasn't planning to come back to Canada in 6 months. I wrote down the name and number of the local clinic I used, the name of the doctor I had seen twice, and the name of the man downstairs in my building who had a key and spoke enough English to be useful in an emergency. I put all of it in a document and sent it to both my kids. Then I went home and dealt with the folder. Cynthia came by while I was partway through it. She looked at the papers spread across the table and asked if Isabel had suggested all this. I said, "Pretty much." She sat down across from me and watched me work for a few minutes without saying anything. Then she said, "You feel better now, don't you?" It wasn't really a question. I said, "Yeah, I think I do." I told her I wasn't changing her situation in any of these documents. We hadn't been together long enough for that to make sense, and she already knew I felt that way. But I also told her that if things kept going the way they were going, that would be a conversation worth having eventually, the same way any serious couple would have it. She nodded. She said, "I know. That's how it should be." A few months have passed since Isabel's visit. Cynthia and I are still together. We don't live together. We're not talking about marriage, at least not in any concrete way. I'm okay with that. At 63, it's tempting to feel like you have to make everything official fast, like the clock is running and you can't afford to take your time. I don't want to make decisions from that place. I've made enough rushed ones already. Isabel asks about Cynthia now. She joined a video call a few weeks ago for a few minutes, and the two of them talked like it was nothing. Craig is still quieter about it, but the questions have a different tone. Less interrogation, more curiosity. I can work with that. I understand now that my kids weren't wrong to ask the questions they asked. They caught me at a moment when I was too wrapped up in my own happiness to hear them properly. I had finally started feeling like myself again after years of not feeling like anything, and I mistook concern for criticism. That wasn't fair to them. There's a question I still think about, the one Craig asked on that Sunday call. "Dad, have you changed the beneficiary on your RRSP?" When he first said it, I heard it like he was already dividing things up before I was gone. Now I understand what he was actually asking. Are you thinking clearly? Are you making decisions with your eyes open? Do you have a plan that isn't just whatever feels right in the moment? At the time, the honest answer was no. I didn't have a plan. I had a feeling, and I was protecting the feeling more than I was protecting the people I love. My kids know where everything is now. Cynthia knows where she stands, and she has never once asked me to put her anywhere other than where it actually makes sense for her to be. And I feel, for the first time since I landed here, like I'm not just living my life but actually managing it. I didn't come to the Philippines to find someone. I came here to find a way to keep going. Cynthia was just there one Tuesday evening, easier to talk to than I expected, and neither of us planned what came after. I don't know what comes next for us. I'm not trying to figure that out today. But if you were in my son's position, would you have asked about the RRSP too? I'd genuinely like to know.